Ann-Margret has always spoken of Elvis Presley with warmth, respect, and something more elusive, a glimmer in her eyes that time has never dimmed. They were two of the brightest stars of the 1960s, drawn together in a way neither could explain. For a moment, it seemed inevitable they would marry. Fans waited for the announcement. The press circled. Friends whispered it was only a matter of time. Yet it never happened. And what Ann-Margret finally revealed about why still carries a weight she has never been able to shake. When Ann-Margret arrived in Hollywood in the early 1960s, she was a rising force. The camera loved her. Studios saw her as the perfect blend of elegance and fire. Her performance in Bye Bye Birdie turned her into a sensation almost overnight, and offers began pouring in. Yet, no script would alter the course of her life more than Viva Las Vegas. That's where she would meet Elvis Presley. Elvis was already a phenomenon, a man whose fame had reached levels almost no one in entertainment history had experienced. By the time filming began in 1963, he was the undisputed king of rock and roll, and his movie career was still drawing huge crowds. The studio executives knew pairing him with Ann-Margret would create fireworks on screen. They were right, but no one predicted the fire that would ignite off camera. From their first scene together, there was an ease, a playfulness, and an unspoken connection. Crew members noticed how they gravitated toward each other even between takes, as though the rest of the set faded away. Ann-Margret would later describe it as an instant recognition, two performers who understood the pressure of living under constant public scrutiny, yet found comfort in each other's presence. What they shared went beyond attraction. Both came from modest beginnings and had worked relentlessly to earn their place in show business. Both understood the loneliness that came with fame. They spoke the same language of ambition and discipline, yet also shared a mischievous streak that made them laugh like old friends. The chemistry wasn't staged for the cameras, it flowed naturally. Every smile, every glance in Viva Las Vegas felt genuine because it was. The film's director, George Sidney, later admitted that he didn't need to coax their energy, he simply let them be themselves and captured it. The result was electric. Rumors of a romance began almost immediately, but for once, the tabloids didn't have to embellish. Elvis and Ann-Margret were seen together off-set, riding motorcycles, sharing quiet dinners, and attending events side by side. Friends in their inner circles believed it was more than a fling. They saw two people with a rare bond, one that could easily lead to marriage. Even Elvis's closest aides noticed a change in him. He seemed calmer, more focused, and genuinely happy in Ann-Margret's company. She matched his energy without competing with it, and unlike many around him, she didn't treat him like a commodity. She saw the man, not just the legend. For Ann-Margret, this was not about chasing headlines. She had her own career, her own ambitions, yet she was drawn to the softer side of Elvis, the one who loved gospel music, who played practical jokes on friends, who carried the weight of responsibility for his family. He confided in her, trusted her, and in those months, they built something rare in the world of celebrity, a genuine connection without the need for constant public validation. Still, beneath the laughter and late-night talks, there was an unspoken tension. Elvis was not free to love without conditions. His image was carefully managed, and the expectations on him, both personal and professional, were unlike anything Ann-Margret had experienced before. For now, they kept those conversations quiet. But as filming wrapped and the premiere approached, the question began to press in on them from all sides. Would they take the next step? The answer, as history shows, would not be the one either of them truly wanted. In public, Elvis Presley projected confidence. On stage and on screen, he was a man in control. But privately, his life was not his own. Since his return from military service, every detail of his career and much of his personal life had been managed under the watchful eye of Colonel Tom Parker. The Colonel was not just a manager. He was a strategist who treated Elvis's image as a brand to be tightly controlled. And when it came to relationships, Parker believed the wrong marriage could jeopardize that brand. By the early 1960s, Elvis's public appeal relied heavily on his status as an unattached heartthrob. Every fan who screamed his name at concerts was sold a fantasy that, in some impossible way, he could be theirs. Marriage would shatter that illusion. For Parker, pairing Elvis with a powerful female star like Ann-Margret was even riskier. She wasn't a quiet figure in the background. She was a force in her own right, dazzling, ambitious, and capable of stealing the spotlight. There was also another reality: Elvis's relationship with Priscilla Beaulieu. Though not yet married, she was already living at Graceland, under circumstances Parker considered safer for Elvis's public image. She was young, not part of the Hollywood system, and in the Colonel's eyes, easier to keep out of the headlines. Ann-Margret, by contrast, was a media magnet. Every outing, every photograph, every lingering glance between her and Elvis became front-page news. For Ann-Margret, the scrutiny was intense. She had grown used to reporters probing her life. But with Elvis, the intrusion reached another level. Paparazzi followed her cars. Headlines speculated daily about engagement rings and wedding dates. Every public appearance was dissected for clues. What the world didn't see was the toll it took. She and Elvis could hardly spend time together without it turning into a national conversation. Inside Elvis's world, there was an unspoken hierarchy, and not everyone welcomed her. Some in his circle worried she would upset the balance of power. Others simply didn't trust outsiders. Ann-Margret had to navigate not just her relationship with Elvis, but the fortress of loyalty, politics, and long-standing friendships surrounding him. And then there was Elvis himself. He cared for Ann-Margret deeply, but he was a man pulled in multiple directions. His career obligations were relentless. His personal loyalties were complex. He was tied to his family, committed to the people who had been with him since his earliest days, and bound by the expectations Parker had cultivated over years. Marriage was not a simple matter of love. It was a negotiation with an entire empire built around his name. The strain began to show. What had once been lighthearted and spontaneous started to carry an edge of uncertainty. They still laughed together, still shared quiet moments, but the weight of outside forces pressed harder. Ann-Margret could feel it, even if they didn't speak about it openly. Elvis would change the subject when marriage came up. She, in turn, would pretend not to notice, though deep down she already understood. Yet even in those moments, they were drawn back to each other. The pull was too strong to ignore. Both knew they were caught in something extraordinary, and something that could not last. Still, neither was ready to let go. Not yet. In time, the decision would be made for them. And when it came, it left scars neither could erase. By late 1964, the whirlwind around Elvis and Ann-Margret had reached its peak. Viva Las Vegas was still playing in theaters. The press was relentless, and fans had begun to treat their pairing as inevitable. Invitations for joint appearances poured in. Studios floated offers for more films together. On the surface, everything pointed toward a future as Hollywood's ultimate power couple. But beneath that glow, cracks had begun to form. For Ann-Margret, the warning signs came quietly at first. A canceled dinner, a postponed trip. Conversations that once flowed freely now stumbled into awkward pauses. She noticed how certain topics, especially anything about what's next, made Elvis retreat. He would smile, change the subject, or distract her with a joke. She understood the pressures he faced, yet the distance between what they felt in private and what they could admit in public was growing harder to ignore. The moment everything shifted came not during an argument, but in a phone call she hadn't expected. Elvis told her, in careful, halting words, that stories about their romance had reached a point where they were hurting people in his life. He didn't name Priscilla directly, but Ann-Margret understood. The subtext was clear. There were commitments already in place, promises made long before she entered the picture. Continuing their relationship openly would make those obligations impossible to keep. That conversation was not a formal goodbye, yet it carried the weight of one. For the first time, Ann-Margret felt the wall between them harden into something immovable. They still spoke after that, still saw each other in fleeting moments, but something essential had changed. The easy comfort of their connection was now edged with caution. Every laugh was shadowed by the knowledge that time was running out. When Elvis and Priscilla's engagement was announced in 1966, Ann-Margret did not speak publicly. She was in the middle of her own rising career, moving from film to film. But privately, the news cut deep. Friends later recalled that she carried herself with grace, refusing to let bitterness take root. But those close to her knew it was a wound she would carry quietly for years. She once admitted, years later, that she and Elvis had a mutual understanding, one built on trust and a promise to protect what they had shared. That meant no public accusations, no interviews designed to stir controversy, no undermining each other in the press. Theirs was a chapter to be honored, not exploited. Still, honoring it didn't erase the ache. The truth was, Ann-Margret had loved him, not the legend, not the headlines, but the man who sang gospel late at night, who teased her about her Swedish accent, who saw past her public persona in a way few others ever did. And walking away from that wasn't a choice she made lightly. It was the only choice left. Even decades later, when asked directly why she never married Elvis, she did not speak in absolutes. Instead, she spoke of timing, of circumstance, and of how some connections are real but cannot survive the weight of the world around them. In her words, it was never about not wanting to. It was about knowing that in the life they were living, wanting wasn't enough. That understanding would become the heart of her later reflections, the reason she could look back with both love and regret. And it was that blend of emotions, still present after all the years, that revealed just how deep the loss truly ran. After Elvis married Priscilla in 1967, most assumed the chapter with Ann-Margret had closed for good. But those who knew them best understood it wasn't that simple. While their romantic relationship had ended, the bond they shared never truly faded. They had made a quiet promise to each other, one built on mutual respect and the understanding that certain parts of their story would remain just theirs. It was an unspoken pact. No sensational interviews, no public betrayals, no tabloid-fueled bitterness. In an industry where former lovers often traded privacy for publicity, they chose silence. That silence wasn't cold, it was protective. Elvis had his life in Memphis, his career demands, and later a family to raise. Ann-Margret had her own path, moving from film roles to concert stages. Yet the connection lingered in the spaces between their public lives. They stayed in touch, usually in ways that escaped public notice. There were phone calls at odd hours, holiday cards, and rare backstage visits. These moments weren't about rekindling romance, but about keeping a piece of that original connection alive. It was a reminder that what they had meant, something worth holding on to, even from a distance. For Ann-Margret, keeping that promise came with a cost. She carried memories she couldn't share, moments she wanted to speak about, but wouldn't, out of loyalty. It meant watching from the sidelines as Elvis's life unfolded, the triumphs, the struggles, the changes in his health, knowing she would always remain just outside the frame. There were times she wondered if speaking openly would bring her relief, but she always came back to the same conclusion. Protecting his memory mattered more than easing her own ache. The entertainment industry moved on, but the undercurrent of their story never truly disappeared. Every so often, a journalist would try to press her for details. She would smile, offer a gracious line about friendship and admiration, and leave it at that. But in rare moments, she let a hint of the truth slip through, a softness in her voice, a faraway look in her eyes when his name came up. Those close to her knew those expressions weren't for the cameras. Elvis, too, seemed to honor the boundary. He never dismissed her or reduced what they had to a passing fling. In the few instances he spoke of her, there was warmth and a certain fondness that stood apart from how he spoke of others. It was as though he, too, knew that trying to explain it publicly would only cheapen it. Years later, when Ann-Margret was asked directly if she had ever considered marrying Elvis, her answer was careful but telling. She said that love, in their case, was never the problem. Circumstances were. They existed in a world where timing and obligation outweighed personal desire, where protecting each other sometimes meant staying apart. It was a reality she accepted, but not one that came without regret. Even now, she admits that certain songs, certain places, still bring him back to her in an instant. Not the superstar, not the man in the jumpsuit under blinding stage lights, but the man she once knew, laughing, unguarded, and entirely himself. That is the Elvis she kept, the one she never let the world fully see. And perhaps the reason the story of why they never married still carries such weight. On August 16, 1977, news of Elvis Presley's death spread with the speed of a lightning strike. The world mourned a cultural giant, but for Ann-Margret, the loss was personal in a way few could grasp. She was performing in Lake Tahoe when she got the call. The details were still unclear, only that Elvis was gone, and the reality hit her like a physical blow. She didn't wait for the press releases or the televised tributes. Within hours, she was on a plane to Memphis. Most of the public didn't know she was there, but those inside Graceland that week never forgot it. She didn't come for the cameras or the headlines. She came because she needed to be close to the people who had loved him most, and because she still counted herself among them. Inside the mansion, the air was heavy with shock. Friends, family, and longtime members of Elvis's inner circle were gathered in small, quiet groups. Ann-Margret moved through the rooms with the quiet grace that had always defined her, offering comfort where she could, receiving it when she needed to. It was a reunion under the worst possible circumstances, yet it also spoke volumes about the depth of the bond she and Elvis had shared. Later, she would describe those days in Memphis as both a blur and a series of frozen moments. Seeing his familiar surroundings without him, there was almost unbearable. Hearing his music play in the background felt like both a tribute and a wound. She didn't try to make sense of it in public, but privately, she admitted that the finality of his passing was unlike anything she had faced before. In the days following his death, Ann-Margret avoided interviews. She turned down offers to write tell-all accounts. She could have capitalized on the world's hunger for intimate stories about Elvis, but she refused. Protecting his memory was more important than satisfying public curiosity. What they had shared belonged to them, and she would not break that trust, not even now. Still, the loss forced her to confront questions she had been able to push aside for years. What if they had married? What if she had fought harder against the pressures that kept them apart? Would she have been able to help him in his later struggles, or would their marriage have collapsed under the same weight that strained his other relationships? She knew there were no clear answers, only the ache of wondering. One thing she did know, her decision not to marry Elvis was never about lack of love. It was about survival, his and hers. They had lived in a world that would have scrutinized every move, tested every vow, and perhaps magnified every flaw until it broke them. In her heart, she believed they had chosen the path that spared them a public unraveling, even if it meant sacrificing a private happiness neither would find again. When Ann-Margret finally spoke about Elvis in later years, it was with that same blend of love and sorrow. She never tried to rewrite their history or paint it in perfect colors. She acknowledged the imperfections, the missed chances, and the reality that some stories don't end the way they're supposed to, yet still matter more than anyone can measure. Ann-Margret has lived a life filled with acclaim, reinvention, and remarkable resilience. Yet, when the subject turns to Elvis Presley, something in her voice still softens. The years have given her perspective, but they have not erased the tenderness or the ache. She has said that some connections are too rare to be defined by titles or timelines. Marriage would have been one chapter, but what they had was an entire story, one she carries with her even now. She never framed their decision as a failure, only as a reality shaped by the world they lived in. The pressures of fame, the obligations already in place, and the need to protect each other all played their part. To the public, it may seem like a love story that never found its ending. To her, it was one that found its own kind of preservation, untouched by the bitterness and unraveling that so often follow public relationships. Still, the fact remains. The choice not to marry Elvis was not a choice made lightly. It was a sacrifice. She walked away knowing she would never replace what they had. And in the quiet moments of her life, in the spaces where his songs still echo, or when a memory catches her off guard, she feels the weight of that absence. Not in regret for loving him, but in the knowledge that love alone wasn't enough. For Ann-Margret, the why has always been less important than the truth of what they shared. And perhaps that is why it still hurts. Because, in a lifetime of extraordinary moments, few have matched the way she felt when she was with Elvis Presley. And no matter how many years have passed, a part of her will always wonder what might have been. For more emotional stories, check out this video.